Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining this webinar of the Media Freedom Rapid Response in Europe. Today we're gathered for a special session on impunity and the true cost of journalism. And we're going to speak about 3 emblematic cases of journalist murders on the European continent, including the case of Jan Kuciak, an investigative journalist from Slovakia. In 2 days, on the 21st of February, it will be 6 years ago since his murder and the murder of his fiancée, Martina Kušnírová. Today we're joined by Lukas Diko from the Investigative Center of Jan Kuciak, who will speak about this case, followed by Massimo Moratti from the Osservatorio Balcani, Caucaso Transeuropa, who will speak on the case of Serbian journalists Slavko Ćuruvija. And lastly, Baris Altintas from the Media and Law Studies Association, who will speak about the case of Hrant Dink, a Turkish journalist who was murdered. And in this case, in this session, we will particularly talk about impunity. Murdering a journalist is the gravest form of censorship there is, but the long years of impunity afterwards even perhaps make a more damaging impact on the state of press freedom in our countries. Lastly, my name, by the way, is Jasmijn de Zeeuw. I work for Free Press Unlimited on a project called Safe World for the Truth, in which we investigate cold cases of journalist murders to work for justice and to mitigate these damaging effects of impunity and strive for justice all over the world, including most recently in a Greek case of Socrates Joyas, who was murdered in 2010. To start this webinar, I would like to start with you, Lukas, and ask you to speak a little bit, for those who don't know the case of Jan Kuciak, about who Jan was and about the anniversary of his murder this week.
First of all, thank you very much for having me and for hosting this event, because I think it's of an utmost importance to talk about the murders of journalists in Europe, and the situation is getting worse and people are starting to forget about the murdered journalists, I think, as it is in the case of Jan Kuciak. If I should introduce Jan, he was a young investigative journalist and data journalist from Aktuality.sk, Slovak online media, and he was investigating Panama Papers and also other cases, including cases connected to Slovak businessman Marian Kočner. But on the 21st of February 2018, he was murdered in cold blood in his house together with his fiancée Martina Kušnírová, and this murder had shaken Slovak society at the time. There were really large public protests that led to resignation of police president at the time, Minister of Interior at the time, and also after a few weeks, also Prime Minister at the time, Robert Fico, has resigned. And then the murder was properly investigated, and the case was submitted to the court. And as we can see, a lot of other cases of high-level corruption, money laundering, or other cases came out based on the investigation of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírová's murder. As of today, the case is still at the court. Murderer himself, the intermediator, and the driver of the hitman were sentenced to long jail terms. Intermediary or the middleman, he cooperated with the police. That's why police was able to find out that allegedly Marian Kočner and his co-conspirator Alena Žužová were the original or put the original order of the murder at the beginning. But we can see the complications at the court with regards to these two people. Last year, Alena Žužová was sentenced for ordering the murder of Jan Kuciak for 21 years, and Marian Kočner was acquitted, as court has said that there is not enough evidence. We analyzed the written verdict, which is always the most important part of the verdict, and we found out some inconsistencies in the verdict and some evidence that was not put into consideration by the court. So we published this, and as of now, the case is at the Supreme Court, which will maybe decide or discuss the case this year, because there are appeals from the side of prosecutor, from the side of the families, and also from the side of Alena Žužová and Marian Kočner. So this is the current status. We don't know when the court will decide. But what is much more important here in Slovakia, that after the September 2023 parliamentary elections, Robert Fico and his party and the parties that were in the government in 2018 at the time of the murder are again in the power. Robert Fico is again the prime minister, and one of the first steps of the government was to change criminal law, and it has passed parliament, but we will see if it will go into effect next month, because there is some legal dispute, and it will be submitted to Constitutional Court by Slovak President Zuzana Čaputová. And in connection with the Jan Kuciak case, the new criminal law cancels or abolish whole special prosecutor's office for fight against the corruption and organized crime. So this office will be dismissed, and this office also is responsible for prosecutors in Jan's case. That means that there was possibility that recent prosecutors who are on the case for at least 2 years, and this is really complicated case, they will be dismissed too. But Prosecutor General has said that he will leave all the cases by the current prosecutors, but there is no written statement by him. So we will see if it will be the case, and then we will also see if the current prosecutors will be still on the case of Jan Kuciak. In terms of other changes in the criminal law, we can see lowering of the punishments for many corruption crimes, many money laundering. We can see shortening of the periods when you can investigate from 20 years to 10 years. In a number of cases, we can see lowering the sums of the money or increasing the sums of the money which you need to launder or steal or take a bribe to be criminally charged. So we can see that it definitely will have great effect on whole criminal law and law enforcement in Slovakia, but it's not in effect yet, even though government is strongly pushing, because if it would be in effect only for 1 day, it will affect all the cases from the past, and also I think some of the cases that will be tried or investigated in the future. My last remark, and why I said at the beginning that it's important to remember all the murdered journalists, and especially in the Europe, because these murders are really tragic events, because we can see a rising number of attacks against the journalists, not only physical one, but we can see a lot of attacks online or in person. Investigative Center of Jan Kuciak, as a part of legacy of Jan Kuciak, we started safejournalism.sk platform for monitoring of attacks against the journalist, and we will present the results on the 6th anniversary of Jan's and Martina's murder. And we can see that there was in 9 months around 50 incidents reported to the platform, with some of them serious, journalists being threatened for life and or being threatened by slaps, or majority of the cases were threats and harassment online. With the new government in power, we also can see recently the rising number of attacks against the journalists from the state officials. For example, Robert Fico threatened some of the most important media in Slovakia by canceling the accreditation at the office of the government. This threat was not fulfilled, but we can see also other members of his party, either members of parliament or members of government. For example, last week they submitted a criminal complaint against one of the really important and well-known journalists from Denik and Martin Milan Šimečka. And also we can see harassment campaigns against other journalists online by the members of the parliament, or in the case of our center, we were threatened by high-profile state public servant at the Ministry of Culture. And this was submitted to MFRR and also was submitted to Council of Europe. So we can see the situation is worsening. That's why we are more and more active. And maybe last remark is that in terms that one of our goals as investigative center is to investigate by journalistic means the cases. We can see that less and less people is willing to work as an investigative journalist in Slovakia.
Yeah, thank you, Lukas. And that's, I think, particularly damning news, because if I remember, like last year when we were with the MFRR present at the 5th year anniversary, there was, of course, a mood of great sadness commemorating the murder, but also the sense of strength and optimism because of all the structural changes that had been achieved since Jan's murder, and all the protests and public support there had been for protecting media freedom and protecting journalists. And now, of course, as you described, the context and the sentiment has shifted drastically. Do you see that already, in addition to these attacks, also the protection layers for journalists and media are worsening? Is the new government also attacking these structural changes like they are in the terms of the prosecution of corruption, as you described?
We haven't seen any steps, but we heard the threats. And it is important to mention that current Minister of Culture is a prominent disinformation figure, and this is also a threat to journalists. So, but there were threats about, for example, laws against NGOs who have grants from abroad and so on. So some of the threats that are similar to the situation in Hungary in few years ago. And also we can see that definitely government will change the way public broadcaster is organized as of now. And we can see that they also, when they were adopting state budget for 2024, they lowered the promised amount of GDP by almost 60 million euros. So they put the budget back few years ago. So we can see definitely the pressure against the free media, and it is important to mention that our protection platform is independent from the state, but cooperating with some of the bodies. We haven't had any experience that the standards which were implemented over the past few years, even though it was not much done by even by the previous government, that these standards will be lowered. But we are prepared to help journalists by the means we can on our own as the independent platform. We will see how the new government will deal with the protection of journalists, but we can see that a lot of perpetrators of attacks or incitements of the attacks come from the politicians of the government, and then you can see a lot of their followers attacking journalists based on these incitements of the attacks, and that's really dangerous for the whole journalistic community.
And perhaps lastly, before we continue to Massimo, what are your expectations for the Supreme Court decision in the case?
I have no expectations, but after the first trial, Supreme Court overturned the decision of the first instance court, and based our analysis, even though I respect the independence of the judiciary, but based on the analysis and of the mistakes that we could find as journalists, not as lawyers. By journalistic means, I think that there is high possibility that Supreme Court would overturn the decision of the first instance court. So after 6 years since the murder, the case could go once again to the first instance court. So it's it's too long to find the truth or justice for Jan and Martina.
Yeah, then it will start all over again. That's a horrible journey also for the family members and colleagues. Yes. We'll talk later again also in relation to the other cases, but maybe this is also a good connection to Massimo and the case of Slavko Ćuruvija, where we also saw a very disappointing judgment a couple of weeks ago. Maybe you could speak a little bit about the case and also talk about this recent developments.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I'll present the case, also placing it in the context of those years and how, 20 murder happened almost 25 years ago, and how the difficult transition has taken place. I mean, I'm not a journalist myself, I'm more a human rights practitioner, so that my angle comes mostly from the point of view of human rights law and also to show the failures of the state in this regard. So we need to have in mind the difficult post-conflict situation in Serbia in 1998 and 1999, after the wars in Bosnia Herzegovina and in Croatia, and the fact that there was a new conflict looming, conflict in Kosovo. At that time, in Serbia, there was Milosevic, who was in power, the Socialist Party. They had been in power for a decade, and they were in a coalition with the Serb Radical Party led by Vojislav Šešelj. Curiously, the current president of Serbia at that time was Minister of Information at the time of the murder of Ćuruvija. As the situation was worsening in Kosovo, there were more and more talks by the Western countries to intervene militarily, even outside the Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council, and it was threatening a bombing campaign. So this is the situation where the murder of Ćuruvija happened. So Slavko Ćuruvija, he was a professional journalist, always committed and always focused on very sensitive political and societal issues. He was working for a state-owned media until 1996, then he left and he created the first independent media in Serbia, first the Weekly Telegraph, then the Daily Telegraph. At the same time, he also created a magazine called The European. The situation is, we are now in October 1998, where there are the NATO announced its plan to bomb Serbia. Ćuruvija openly challenged the government, and his telegraph is immediately basically banned and put out of, not allowed it to print. This was on the 14th of October 1998. Nevertheless, he manages to publish it from Montenegro. So on the 19th of October, the sequence here is important. On the 19th of October, he publishes an article, What's Next, Milosevic? And he's challenging openly the Milosevic regime and making a list of all the shortcomings, all the problems of the dictatorship. The day after, the parliament of Serbia passes a law that imposes draconian fines on media that are threatening the national security. 2 days later, a lawsuit is brought against Ćuruvija and his newspapers, and the lawsuit basically is decided the day after, retroactively. So basically, they applied retroactively the law to sanction the article that European published in October 1998. Basically, within 5 days, the newspapers were fined for 250,000 Deutschmark at the time. The fine had expired, and all the property of the newspapers had been confiscated and sold. So within 5 days from the publication of the article, 7 days from the publication of the article. This is a clear attempt to quash the work of Ćuruvija. Nevertheless, Ćuruvija continued to publish, continued to And in March 1999, he was even sentenced to 5 months of jail, but his lawyers managed to block that and sort of like to avoid it. It is interesting in this regard to have in mind that Ćuruvija was in contact with Mira Marković and Slobodan Milošević. He had access to them. There were some relationship between them. But in 1998, this relationship deteriorated dramatically. And of course, as a result, a few days later, Mira Marković openly labeled Ćuruvija as an enemy of the country. A government-affiliated newspaper said, Ćuruvija is wishing the bombs for Serbia. And on the 11th April 1999, while the NATO airstrikes were ongoing, and after Ćuruvija has been placed under surveillance by the state security agency, he was murdered on his way home, basically on the threshold of his house. His partner survived; she was spared by the Serbs. So this was 1999, 25 years ago. Things changed. There was a transition in Serbia. Milosevic was ousted on the 5th of October 2000. There was an uneasy coalition in the years immediately, composed by reformists and by some forces that were like similar to Milosevic, let's say. But the old system, the security apparatus behind the murder of Ćuruvija, survived, and it is surviving still today. The Prime Minister of Serbia, Đinđić, was killed in 2003, and this was, clearly was a result of the old security apparatus. So only in 2008, basically, there was some openings, but the government at the time was too weak with the wrongdoings, with the legacy of murders that was conducted during the conflict years and afterwards by the state security forces. So openly in 2009, the prosecutor said there is no evidence for this case. All the evidence was stuck with basically with the state security forces. We are moving forward in time. Reforms happened in Serbia. The former Radical Party reformed into a progressive, Serb Progressive Party, and they came to power in 2012 with the former Socialist Party. So the same parties that were in charge in 1999. However, they reformed, they pledged to be pro-European, and in the meantime, the pressure of the civil society, and especially of the journalist association, continues. So finally, in 2013, Alexander Vučić, who was a deputy prime minister at the time, agrees to the creation of a commission for the investigation of the murder of journalists. And this was thanks to the insistence of Veran Matić. At the time, was editor-in-chief of B92. So Ćuruvija is one of the 3 journalists who is going to be investigated by this commission. Things start moving on. There is this opening, and the same Vučić says, I will resign if the perpetrators are not punished. But the investigation starts 15 years later. The investigation will not go into the perpetrators, to the instigators of the murders, like Mira Marković, who at the time was still alive. The investigation will also only focus on 4 persons related to the state security: the head of the state security, Marković, the head of the Belgrade State Security Department, Radonjić, and then 1 operative and 1 reservist, were Romić and Kurak. And these were the ones where the focus of the investigation will be. The same Vučić, who was at the time Minister of Information, has never been summoned to talk as a witness. So this is another shortcoming. The main witness was the Milorad Ulemek Legija, the person who has been the perpetrator and the organizer of the killing of Đinđić, who has been given the statements. So this is where the investigation led at that time. There was a number of shortcomings, there were a number of threats on the main investigator himself. And in 2015, there was the first trial. It started. it ended in 2019, and the four persons who were indicted were sentenced to a total of over 100 years of jail. However, I mean, one of the shortcomings is that there's no clear identification of who actually pulled the trigger, who killed Ćuruvija, and the court introduced another person. So there was a fifth person who apparently killed, and this was not being clarified, and this was not contained in the initial indictment. As a result, first instance decision in 2019 is quashed a few months later. Second trial started in October 2020, and in December 2021, similar decision, very similar decision to the first instance decision is passed, and again with the same flows. In December 2022, the case came again before the Tribunal of Appeal, and the decision was basically brought in April 2023, and however, it was announced only a few days ago, on the 2nd of February 2024. 10 months of delay, unclear why. The speculation is that they were expecting the most appropriate moment. As we know, all four persons were acquitted, and so at the moment, it seems that the prosecutor has submitted an appeal to the Supreme Court for check of legality, but it's unclear whether the trial can be reopened or whether these suspects will be able to be walk free. The lawyers fear they will be able to be free. It's the decision. I mean, the acquittal was really created a lot of upset animosity in Serbia, but also a feeling that the old system prevailed. It's curious the reaction of the authorities. The appeal tribunal said it was the fault of the first instance of the prosecution. It's not our fault. The politicians, Prime Minister, Minister of Justice, said, we respect the independence of the judiciary. However, as private citizens, we condemn it. Same Vučić said. So it was completely, leaving somebody else with the hot potato. So this was the situation now. There were protests that were organized later on. I have to say that this is not an isolated case. I mean, the state security has been responsible for a number of egregious murders during those years, and where most of these have been not trialed. But to date, there is no real way of shedding light on these cases. The bitter conclusion is that, basically everybody knows that Ćuruvija was killed by the state, but the law enforcement and the judiciary failed to prove it, what everybody knows. And this is where we are now.
Yeah, thank you. And it's incredibly disappointing because also among this body of cases that are unsolved in Serbia, this is often seen as an emblematic case, right? Where all eyes are focused on. If this case doesn't succeed, the others probably won't either, I believe is the general perception. What do you think has been the impact of this latest acquittal on the Serbian media community, and what has in general been the impact of impunity in the murder of Ćuruvija on media in Serbia?
The Serbian media community is quite embattled, and are quite at least the ones that are professing themselves as independent media. And we met them last year, and they're ready to push this case. But clearly, what we don't see is the ones who are not coming forward, the ones who are adopting self-censorship. There is also a big pluralism of big problems of pluralism in Serbia. Where the government controlling, having its own tabloids, its own media, and allowing very little space for other independent media with the national coverage. So, it's kind of it's very much entrenched, the situation at the moment. We don't know how many have been, there's been self-censorship, but, it's, we're talking about a sort of capture state in Serbia, where even the security forces, the judiciary, they're all kind of somehow controlled by the government, So, there's a few voices speaking up there, but, and we need to act to protect them.
Thanks. Perhaps I think good to go to Baris, and then we can wrap up in the end with drawing some connections between these situations. Baris, you will speak about the case of Hrant Dink, who was murdered in 2007, also a case with many legal turns and twists. Can you speak a bit about the views on Hrant and his work as a journalist in Turkey, and then the current status of the case?
Yeah, of course. It's a very long and complicated case, but I want to just first start saying that we, as the Media and Law Studies Association, we do like an unsolved murders panel every year, where we have, and the first year we had the Dink family, the families of the murdered journalists, and we would usually have international guests. And I'm saying this because we talk later that, you know, there are many common aspects to these murders, but over the past years, we've had Matthew Carona Galizia, you know, Daphne Caruana Galicia's son. We've had Natalia Estemirov's daughter, Lana, who's journalist slash human rights defenders. We have had Colombian journalists. We had colleagues of Pavel Šeremit. For Slavko Ćuruvija, we've had Veran Matic, you know, explain us the process as including, you know, the families of Turkish murder families. And I want to first start off saying that in most of these murders where, you know, there's involvement of the state, like Massimo said, you know, everybody knows. There are many common points, and I want to start speaking about Hrant's story a little bit about, you know, mentioning these, because in a nutshell, the judiciary process I'm going to get into, but it's not, of course, justice hasn't been done, basically. So, but in all of these murders, what we see first is basically the starts with the targeting of the person. So I'm saying this because there's always like earlier steps where we can basically intervene. And in the case of Hrant Dink, so Hrant Dink was the editor-in-chief of a bilingual Armenian-Turkish newspaper called Agos, and he was also very smart, very critical journalist, and who had a you know, very sharp views on the Armenian genocide issue, and he was, you know, he criticized both sides. He was he also wrote for other Turkish media, so he's a, you know, he had been in journalism forever, basically, even before setting up Agos. And so first in 2004, he published an article in Agos, or maybe it didn't have his byline Agos, and they said that Sabiha Gökçen, who was the adopted daughter of Atatürk, had Armenian descent, or could have had Armenian roots. And this drew a lot of backlash from these, you know, what is the word? Nationalistic communities. He was in the headline of the Hürriyet newspaper. And then the army, the general staff issued a statement on Sabiha Gökçen's heritage, basically. And at some point, Dink was actually called by the Istanbul governor's office, where they had a talk. And he was warned about, you know, oh, you know, this can lead to potential unrest. So you actually have, like, you know, targeting, warnings, threats, basically. And then nationalist groups started protesting outside Agos's office. I think it was, again, maybe May or April, I have the date somewhere. They started this legal action against him using this article we call, 301. It's called Insulting Turkishness. And, you know, it was very controversial, and it still remains in place to this day. And this might have been April or May. And then of course, in 2007, on January 19, he was basically murdered right in broad daylight outside his office. And there were a lot of, you know, other threats in between. And just to, you know, save time, I didn't go into them, but I just want to note that during this trial, the 301 trial, and he was actually convicted, there were a lot of these nationalist, neo-nationalist groups, you know, coming to the courtroom, threatening him and his family. So it was like it had turned into a whole, I don't know, it had the appearance of this, you know, state orchestrated event. And like right after his murder, so in all of these cases, you know, you have to put a lot of effort into bringing, you know, getting some sort of justice. And you know, actually, there's the Metin Göktepe murder, and to some extent, even the, you know, Ćuruvija murder, quote unquote, are among the better examples. But, you know, there's a lot of pushing, there's commissions, you know, working, even whatever. So I want to say that that went well, and I think well, as in considering other cases in Hrant Dink's case, and hundreds of thousands of people attended his funeral, and that was the start of it. There was hundreds of thousands of people in Istanbul, holding "I'm also Armenian" cards, and we also refer to Hrant Dink's murder not just as a journalist murder, but also hate crime, because he was basically killed for the Sabiha Gökçen Armenian article, and then the legal process started. And I've taken some notes, and I'm not gonna. It's very complicated. It's a case that went on for 17 years, and now it's going to retrial, as you all know, because of the recent decision in November last year. But basically, this also in all of these murders, which also almost all of these murders, there was another common point where those in power always promised that they will shed light onto this. This happened with Daphne. This happened with when they were setting up the commission. Maybe not Milosevic himself at the time, but Vučić said, "Oh yes, we're like you." Massimo said, "Oh, this is my honor. We're gonna solve this." This is always this. And after Dink's murder, we also saw this. Erdogan is like, "This is the state's honor. We'll definitely shed light on it." And a lot of promises were given. And as the proceedings continued, it became evident that there were a lot of security officials from the gendarmerie forces and the Trabzon department, the police department, were involved. And so the person who shot Hrant Dink, Ogün Samas, was a minor. He was, I think, 16 at the time. And then he was caught when maybe 10 hours later, his dad saw his photo on the screen, called the police, and he was arrested, detained. And the first thing we knew, the first clue, is that we had two police officers in front of a Turkish flag having taken a selfie with him. So starting from this, and as the trial process went on, it's a long, very protracted trial. And initially, so now there are 78 suspects. There have been decisions about 78, and in the before when it first started, there were about, I think, 40 people in prison, 22 gendarmerie officials, some higher ups. Initially, they didn't want to give, you need a permission to try the police department head for Ramazan Akyürek. Initially, they didn't, but then they did, because also in between, the Turkish coup attempt happened in 2016. And all of a sudden, the court process was going on, the narrative changed, and then it became such that this murder was committed by the Fethullah Gülen organization, which Turkey says this is the Islamist sect, which is the previous allies of Erdogan government, and now newly enemies, and they say they are behind the coup. And then they said this was organized by this Fethullah terrorist organization, as Turkish courts call them, and it was basically committed by them. So during all these trials, there was a lot of allegations, complicity. But one thing came out is that definitely they knew at every stage that because the soldiers, the gendarmerie soldiers, were telling it at every stage that this murder was being planned, and it was going to be implemented at every step. They knew, they planned it, they allowed it, they knew about it. And there were two other people who were arrested along with the hitman. So three people were, like, the hands-on crowd, the trigger people, and the others. But all in all, the hitman, Ogün Samas, was released in November, also last year, after being in prison for 17 years. And of course, this is not justice done. So those who were responsible were not responsible. I just want to say that even that was possible to a lot of pushing. And then there's the Hrant's Friends group, a lot of, keeping this on the agenda all the time. And I'm not saying we're grateful for this 16 years, but I'm just saying that normally, even that guy could have not done the time. And now it's gone to retrial. So the Court of Cassations has basically approved the decisions for some of them, but it's wants a retrial for like 68 of them. And also in the meanwhile, these police department officers, everybody was given different sentences, 6 to 7 years. Ogün Samas was given a life sentence. His handler, Erhan Tuncel, he was given, I think, about also 8 years for complicity. He did time, he was 6, 7 years, and he was out. In the last hearing in November, there was only one remaining person outside Samast in prison. He was also released. So basically, there will be another retrial, and I don't want to, give like a very boring detail, but so there was the possibility that Ogün Samas could be given another 7 years because of this law called. I know this is very boring. I just want to highlight this. It's this law called being a member of a terrorist acting on behalf of a terrorist organization without it being its member, or also being a member of a terror organization, which is both 7 years. But so the Court of Cassation said, oh, he should be also given this. But under Turkish law, when the Court of Cassation's ruling came out, that the state of limitations of time had already passed for that accusation. So he's going to have now this trial, but they will drop it automatically because of this. I just wanted to say at every stage how the state officials have committed, and now they are basically protecting him. Sorry, I know it's. I said I would keep it short,
no,
but it's a very, very lengthy trial. And at the time, yes, we have the hitman, we have some convictions, but of course, this trial is by far not over. We still haven't seen the people who murdered who ordered Dink's murder brought to justice as of yet.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that's a really important point that I wanted to ask you a question about, but also Lukas and Massimo, because I think in all these 3 cases, in general, all over the world in these cases, we see that the masterminds are hardly ever pursued. With enough pressure, governments occasionally start to pursue the hitmen or material authors, but those ordering the murders are indeed often left free. However, in all of these 3 cases, at least some attempts was done to pursue them. If you look at the campaigns that you've all also been involved in for these 3 cases, what do you think have been effective ways of pressuring authorities to at least make steps, and what have been the obstacles towards getting those masterminds convicted? Maybe Baris first, because you were just speaking on this.
Yes, I wanted to say something about this. I think I think I actually have a depressive outlook on this. I think pushing it, like people like Dink's friends, hundreds of thousands coming out. In the 90s, Turkey, like in Serbia, had a lot of murders where the public were more reactive. This is extremely important. And for example, in 1996, Metin Göktepe was killed in Evrensel reporter. He was killed in custody. And of course, not very satisfying, but the police officers who killed him in custody at least did some jail. What they did was they moved the court hearings from town to town so that people wouldn't come, but people came anyway, and with the Dink murder as well. And so Turkey had another political murder in 2015. The Kurdish lawyer Tahir Elçi was killed, head of the Diyarbakır Bar Association. And so what I saw there is that, like compared to the biggest murder, the Dink murder 8 years before, there was really not the same public. You didn't have hundreds of thousands. Of course, it was a big funeral. But it was. I think there's a lot of fatigue because of the populist. Whatever we call it, authoritarian. Everything is going on. The world is a bad place. It's horrible. We can't do anything feeling. But to the contrary, with all these murders, it's important to definitely keep up that public support. And that's why it's so important to remember them all the time again and keep them on the agenda, because you're not just remembering them or their work, but also contributing to, asking all the other journalists, intellectuals, human rights defenders, we have a responsibility to bring these to justice, and it should be remembered. It's not going to happen without a fight, and I think keeping that on the agenda is as much as we can, for as long as we can, is a good step in that direction.
Thank you. What are your views on this, Lukas, and on the role of the pursuit of, in this case, Kočner? And
yeah, I completely agree, because I think in 2018, and when the investigation into Jan and Martina's murder was done, it was a unique situation, and I hope there will be no similar murder in the coming years, but I don't think it will be so properly investigated as at the time. And there was also large public pressure, and the only we can do now is to remind people about Jan and Martina and other colleagues that were murdered, because that's the only way. Never stop reminding people that there were journalists killed for their work, and that when there is a captured state or mafia state, or however we would call it, the journalists and investigative journalists are last defense of the society. It was the case in Slovakia at the time, and I think it could be the situation here once again, and I know that it's the situation in other countries. So I encourage everyone, for example, on Wednesday to post some commemorative posts or publish articles on Jan and on anniversaries of the murders of other journalists, to do the same, because it's important, because we can see that not only people have this fatigue and people started to forget about Jan and Martina, but also we can see that a lot of disinformation about Kočner's involvement and not involvement is being spread by politicians, by disinformation actors. So we can see that this fight for truth is here still, even in these cases that had been investigated properly. We can see that it's never-ending fight for us to uncover the truth and to repeat the truth if it's needed. And I think in these cases, it's needed all the time.
And if you look at your analysis of the case and acquittal of Kočner, what do you think have been the main reasons for him still to basically get away with it in this latest decision? What are the kind of situations that masterminds like him, alleged masterminds like him, profit from?
I think that it's really complicated and the case is really complex.
Mm-hmm.
And we run the project Kočner's Library, in which we have a whole file together with OCCRP. We have the whole investigation file of the murder, and it's 53 terabytes of data. So if you can imagine how much of information is that, I think that sometimes judges are just drowned in the, and it seems to us like this, that judges just drown in the amount of information from the investigation, and the line to Kočner was melted. But it's hard to say, but if there is no evidence and Kočner will be definitely acquitted, I will respect it. But if we can see that there are faults and there is evidence that is not properly interpreted by the court, then I think it has to be redone once again by the Supreme Court, because there are some things mentioned in the verdict that never happened or that were made up. The story is part of the story why Ćuruvija was sentenced to jail and Kočner was acquitted, was, I would say, made up by the judges. It was not according to the evidence. But I don't see any bad interest in that. I see, I think there is a problem with the amount of data and the public discussion in the case, and I mean in terms of the verdict.
Yeah, I think this is also in many cases indeed also the complication with the masterminds. Also the way to prove it is much harder, of course, than connecting someone to the hitman. Massimo, if you have if anybody in the audience has questions, also feel free to raise your hand or enter in the chat.
I mean, I have just a couple of thoughts. I mean, because a sad thought that comes to my mind is that even with their death, I mean, these journalists point out at the failures of the state in resolving their cases. So even it's sort of like their legacy exposes weaknesses of the institutions, and especially in the case of Serbia, the weakness of the rule of law in the country, of the democratic and transparent institutions. So this is one thought that comes to mind. Second, I mean, we are tackling the issue here from the point of view of journalists, but as we were thinking about the state security in Serbia has been responsible for a number of murders, not only journalists. So, we should be able to see the forest from the trees. And so that's why I think there should be solidarity amongst victims, even outside the world of journalists, and bring together and to ask for accountability. You know, we need to put it into this context. I would like to see solidarity from the victims across the lines, let's say.
Yeah, I think this is also an important point. I recently attended, for example, the trial of the murder of Peter de Vries, a Dutch journalist who was not murdered, most likely in relationship to his work as a journalist. But there you also see the same interconnection between the murder of a lawyer, the murder of a crown witness, this overall attack on kind of pillars of the rule of law. So I think that's an important point. Lastly, I was also wondering if you have any, this point of international solidarity. These are all three well-known, Baris, perhaps first.
Sorry, just about this last point, I wanted to add something. It's actually gonna about solidarity as well. So, and actually Matthew Karona-Galizia always says that, like, when a journalist is murdered, there's always, you know, it means it's too late. We missed where we can. I think it's very important that when a journalist targeted, physically attacked, we are getting a lot of these. Like Lukas just, described, somebody, politician says something, somebody takes an order from it and, punches him or whatever. And, or when there's a trial, I think it's important for every journalism organization, or like Massimo said, every human rights organization to release a statement, just make aloud as much as possible. And so maybe that could even go to a prevention. It's like, okay, even if it's not one of ours, I'm saying, because journalists can be very fragmented according to ideological lines. This is exactly where this is what solidarity means. This is exactly, yes, we don't like this guy or whatever, we don't care, or we don't think like him, or we don't even like his journalism, doesn't matter. But, everybody should make, a loud noise as much as they can. So maybe starting at an earlier level, of course, not to like both the trial processes, but could be an important step, and having that awareness at every moment is very important. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I think to close, perhaps I wanted to ask you all, you are also involved with your media communities in these countries. What do you see as the impact on young people starting to consider this profession, or people in general considering to enter or to stay in journalism? How would you say, because that underlines, I think, also always this importance of not just fighting for justice for the family members and the colleagues of these journalists, but also in general for the access to information in all of our countries. Perhaps if you have any last reflections that we can close with that topic.
Maybe I can say something. I think maybe not just for young generations, because I see a lot of people in Turkey, which like there's basically no press, no judiciary, everything is dead, but still you have a lot of aspiring journalists in communication departments. But of course, when a journalist or a lawyer or a bright mind of our society is murdered, of course it has a chilling effect. And that is, maybe it doesn't, push away a generation from, pursuing a career. But of course, it is a message to all of us, to everyone. It's actually, so this is the main core of these core idea, is to terrorize everyone else. Don't question my politics. Don't question my corruption, or whatever. That is basically what's the main target is not that person. Of course, it's a tragedy individually for a life cut short and family, but the main target is the entire society.
Yeah, and if I can add, I mean, there's like, especially young journalists or people who want to be journalists, if we combine this with the precarious working conditions of journalists today, the fact that they're unprotected, also from the financial point of view, I mean, this chilling effect is even more amplified, by this situation. So at the end, you are like, tackling it's the investigative journalism, the one that is affected the most. Then the journalism becomes just repeating propaganda points by the politicians. So, becoming spokespersons rather than journalists.
Maybe if I may add, we have some data from 2022 December and 2023 January. We conducted a research in which 400 Slovak journalists participated on the security and safety, and we found out that 66% of them were attacked in the past 12 months. But what we also have found that, and it's just an assumption because it has to be confirmed by other researchers, that there is not new young generation of journalists growing up here, because it was 3 times lower when we did the sociodemography of the journalists participated in the survey. So journalists from 25 to 35 participated 35% of the survey, and below 25 there were just less than 10%. So sociologists told us that this could be the part of the chilling effect of the murder of Jan. People just are scared to become journalists, and also it could be part of all these attacks and harassment online and by politicians. Young people just don't want to be harassed. So there is not as much young journalists. And this is, before you asked about the international reaction, I think this is important to support, I think, education of journalists and to support and mentor those who are interested, because there is not as much of them as in my young ages. And this is important. If we would not have young generation, okay, I will have job till I will be 80, but there will be no generation who will be involved in uncovering the truth, in fighting for free press, and it's important not from the journalistic point of view, but from the point of view of the society that needs to have proven and accountable and ethically achieved information. Otherwise, I think the democratic values are done.
Yeah, thank you, Lukas. And I think that's also the legacy of Jan Kuciak, no? Like a young, brave investigative journalist who kept going, knowing the dangers of what he was uncovering. And I think that's the, also, if I remember the commemoration last year, the image that is kind of instilled in all of our brains, someone so young, traveling across borders, trying to uncover the last stone and paying with such a high price. And I think that's also the legacy that we need to carry forward and that we need to protect in all of our countries, and also in solidarity with each other. So I would like to thank you a lot for participating, and for the audience for joining this webinar. And on Wednesday, we will commemorate Jan and Martina.